people in the world have half the programmers in the world have less than 5 years experience. The reason for that is that the number of programmers in the world seems to double every 5 years. You're laughing. So you might want to reconsider that laughter, but we'll get to that. How many of you have been programmers for more than 10 years? Okay, down by half again. The ratio's holding pretty well. 15 years. Yep, okay. Do we have any 20-year vets in the room? Look at that. Hey, okay, now the ratio's changing a little bit. There's some oldsters who wanted to come to this talk. 25? Good, yeah. 30? Same people. 35? Yeah, okay. Down to one. Down to one. I started programming when I was 12. That would have been in the year 1964. Programming is kind of a strange thing to say. I started programming computers when I was 12. The computer I was programming was a little plastic thing. It had 3 flip-flops and 6 AND gates. It was entirely mechanical. It was a spring-loaded machine. In essence, it was a 3-bit finite state machine. I could make it count. You programmed it by putting little tubes on pegs that would block the AND gate rods from slipping into grooves. You could make it count, you could make it count down, you could make it add or subtract 3 bits. One was the add end, the other was the other add end, and the other was the sum, and then you had to have a carry, so it kind of replaced one of the add ends for that. There were several other little logical puzzles you could get it to do, but that's where I began. And that was 64, so what year is it now? How long ago was that? Was it 55 years ago? 55 years. I got my first real programming job at age 16. It was a temporary job. They let me write a little bit of code for a Honeywell computer, and then they fired me right away because I was 16 years old. Who wants a 16-year-old writing code in there? My father actually made them give me the job. He walked in there and said, "You will give my son a job?" And they said, "Yes, sir." I got that job back when I turned 18, and that was the true beginning of my career. That would have been the year 1970. Someone had walked on the moon a few months before that. Yeah. So let's look at that. The demographics in this room are interesting. The ratio of men to women in the room is not as bad as it is out in the industry at large. The number of women in programming at the moment is on the order of 3%, 97% men. This room looks to be more like 1 in 10, maybe. I'm just kind of guessing. That's a complete inversion of where the women were in the 1950s. Most programmers were women in the 1950s. Almost all of them, all programmers were women in the 1940s, with very few notable exceptions. And that really didn't change much until maybe the early 70s, maybe the late 60s, the early 70s. Something happened and the men flooded into the field. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but before we do, I want to talk about who we are. We're programmers. We are the modern day scribes. Scribes, go back 3,000 years. Hardly anybody knew how to read or write. That was not a skill anybody needed. Right? A few people needed it. Civilization needed it. You could not have a civilization unless there were some people who knew how to read and write. Some people had to be able to write down laws. They needed to be able to read laws. They needed to be able to write down economics. So the scribes of the day were the accountants, as well as the historians, as well as the lawyers. They were a very elite group of people. They made special rules for themselves. Civilization could not exist without them, and therefore they made many rules for themselves. One of those rules was that they paid no taxes. And we're going to come back to that one. They could not be drafted for the military. They had special housing and special privileges. They dressed in a different garb. They had different customs. They had different handshakes and greetings. It was a profession that was handed down through families. If you were the son of a scribe, you became a scribe. If you were the daughter of a scribe, it's not clear what you became in those societies. We live in a time now when you and I can read and write a language that most people can't, most people have no desire to. And our civilization cannot function without this ability to read and write. Look around. How many computers are in this room at the moment? Running code in the moment, at the moment. How many computers do you have on your body at the moment? Now, look at me. I've got my iPhone. How many computers are in this? How many processors are in this iPhone? Well, I take it out of the case because there's a couple of processors in the case. And then there's this. Now there's the main processor in here, and then there's the graphics processor, there's the GPS processor, there's the cellular processor. There's probably 6 or 7 or 8 in here, plus these. Maybe there's 10 processors running code just in this thing that we whimsically call a phone. This is not a phone. This is not even similar to any kind of phone that I grew up with. I don't want to tell you what the kind of phone I grew up with. When I was young, the phone, the telephone, had no dial. You picked it up, and a woman answered. Number, please. The operator answered, and you told her the number. How many computers are in this? Just random things pulling out of my pocket. These are AirPods. How many computers are in this? Well, there's got to be at least one computer in each earpiece. They're talking Bluetooth, right? Somebody's got to be doing that work. And of course, there's a computer in the case. I've got my car key here. So there's a computer in that. How about my watch? Oh yeah, there's a computer in that. I am literally covered with computers. But never mind that. Look at the walls. How many computers are in the walls? Now you got these screens. Clearly there's computers in the screens because you can't even think of a television nowadays without computers in it. But there's a camera up here. There's got to be a computer in that thing. And there's something on the wall. Oh, there it is up there. Now, I don't know exactly what that is. It's probably a wireless hub, definitely a computer in that thing. What's that thing over there? Is that another wireless hub, or is that something else? Well, it's got LEDs, so it's got to have a computer in it. Where's the thermostat? Is there a thermostat in this? Oh, no. Oh, look at this thing. There's a computer in that. Anybody take an elevator to get here? Computers driving the elevators, of course. And what about out on the road? How much code is running in a modern car? A modern car has 100 million lines of code in it. This should scare the hell out of you. There are pieces of metal weighing several thousand pounds moving at high velocity towards you, being controlled by software written by 22-year-olds at 3 in the morning. How many people have been killed because the software in cars malfunctioned? And the answer to that is many dozens. Many dozens of people have died horrible deaths because the software in cars malfunctioned. Most of the software in cars, of course, controls things like the entertainment center and the GPS system. But there is code that connects the accelerator to the engine. There is code that connects the brakes to the engine. When you put your foot on the brake, you'd kind of like to think there's a metal cable running to the calipers that will stop that car, but there are if statements in there. Wouldn't you like to read those if statements? How much damage has been done by bad software? Who knows the story? Well, let's talk about the 737 MAX, shall we? Now that's an interesting one, because that's a software problem. Oh, there's hardware involved in it. But the issue is a software issue. It was a fault that they didn't expect to be a fault. This little thing that they had decided to add almost as an afterthought, the maneuvering characteristics augmentation system, the MCAS system, that was just to correct a slight difference in the way the airplane handled, and they thought, we'll just patch it. We'll just put a little thing in here, just kind of lower the nose if the airplane gets a little out of the envelope. And no one had any thought that it could do what it did. So that's many lives lost just because of an oversight amongst the software developers and the specifiers and the engineers who, in a moment of, maybe we would call it carelessness, I'm not even sure it was careless, but in a moment of not thinking things through completely, added something to an aircraft and managed to kill 300 people. Or you know the story of Night Capital. You know the story of Night Capital. That's not one where lives are lost, at least not exactly lives are lost, but it's just a couple of software guys who did something stupid and lost $450 million in 45 minutes late at night, at midnight. I won't tell you the whole horrible story because it'll raise the hair on the back of your head. Just suffice it to say that the CEO woke up in the morning and he didn't have a company anymore. It was gone. 45 minutes, $450 million, just like that. You and I are programmers. We're the ones doing this. We are the ones that our civilization depends upon. And society doesn't quite understand this yet. Society does not think, wow, the programmers are really significant people in our society. They're the ones that are controlling everything. That you don't hear from folks very often. But it's true. Our society cannot exist without us. There is nothing that happens in our society any longer that is not mediated or controlled or somehow involves a computer. Your grandmother, if you still have one, cannot do anything without interacting with a computer system every minute of her life. Because you can't talk on the phone. You can't watch TV, you can't use the microwave oven or wash any dishes or wash any clothes, can't drive a car, can't buy anything, can't sell anything, can't get insurance, can't file an insurance claim. No law can be enacted, no law can be enforced without a computer being involved, without software being involved every second of the time. We, you and I, are involved with the lives of everyone in the Western world, that's about 1.5 billion people, on a second-by-second basis. We control their destinies. We have an immense amount of power. We rule the world. Other people think they rule the world. And then they hand those rules to us. And we write the rules that execute in the machines that govern everything. How did we get there? So let's go back in time. Let's go back to 1936, to the man who kind of kicked the whole thing off. We could argue about who the first programmer was. There's an argument to say that it was the Countess of Lovelace, Ada, Lord Byron's daughter, who was the first programmer. Not really fair. She never wrote code that executed. She did write some code, although it was code for a machine that was never built. The thing that you could credit her with is she was the very first person, probably, first person we know of, to realize that a machine that manipulates numbers could manipulate anything. She's the first person to connect a numerical calculation with a symbolic calculation, something we do all the time. But that was perhaps the first modern programming thought. The very first programmer, on the other hand, is this guy, Alan Turing, who in 1936 wrote a paper. Has anybody read that paper? Anybody here read Alan Turing's paper? Numbers. He did it in binary. He did it on this machine. It was a fascinating machine. I said it was 22 bits. Where did it store its bits? What kind of memory would a machine like this have used? Nowadays, we're used to memory. Memory comes out of virtually every orifice of our bodies. But in those days, memory was frighteningly expensive. They used, I can show you. Got a picture of it. These were called mercury delay lines. They had a tube of mercury, that's what those tubes are there. Fill it through full of mercury. You put a speaker on one side and a microphone on the other. You pump bits into the speaker, and the bits move through the mercury acoustically, sound waves, right? And they move through the tube, and then a microphone on the other end picks them up, recycles them, and pumps them back into the mercury. So you could think of this as rotating memory, kind of an early disk drive. You could get 1,024 bits into one of those tubes. And you could get it to run at about 1 megahertz, so it would take a millisecond to go all the way around. That was the operating memory of the machine. Problem with it was that whenever a truck went by, the mercury would vibrate. It didn't work all that well, so they eventually changed to using CRT memory, cathode ray tube memory. Who here has seen a cathode ray tube? See all the old people? Good. Television sets. Remember the old television sets when you turned them off and the picture would do this? To a little dot? And as a young boy, I would stand there and watch that dot as it faded slowly away, as the filament in the tube cooled down. Those were cathode ray tubes. Cathode ray tube has an electron gun in it, and it sprays electrons on the screen. That's what makes the phosphors glow. What's interesting about that is that it leaves a little bit of charge depletion behind, and the next time you sweep the electron beam across that area, you can detect that charge depletion in the amount of current you can put through the beam, and therefore you can read what you had written. Therefore, you can put bits on the screen. Alan Turing used this not only as his memory, but as his output device. He would read the results of his computations by looking at a screen that contained memory. You and I don't have to do that anymore, but he did. And now let me tell you what his conclusions were after, a few weeks of writing code for this machine in binary, doing all this interesting invention. He invented subroutines, and he invented the concept of a stack. They had built the machine without putting a stack in, and then as he wrote the code, he realized, we're going to have to remember return addresses. He invented the concept of the stack. What conclusions did he come to? He wrote a little report at the end. He said, this is 1945, we will need a great number of mathematicians of ability. Are you mathematicians of ability? Because there will probably be a good deal of work of this kind to be done. How did he know? A good deal of this kind of work to be done. I think he would be amazed to realize how much of this kind of work we have made for ourselves. But he went on. He didn't stop there. He said, one of our difficulties will be the maintenance of an appropriate discipline, so that we do not lose track of what we are doing. Has anybody here lost track of what they were doing? Right in the middle? Well, you stare at the code and go, did I write that? How did he know? Mathematicians of ability, a great number, appropriate discipline. This was 1945. Now, how long ago was that? Well, 1945, this is now in 2019. Gee, I can do this math. 74 years. It's a person's lifetime. Within the span of one person's lifetime, computers were born and have reached where they are now. I'm a little bit younger than that. I'm 66. 1945, the number of computers in the world, 1, or at least big O of 1, on the order of 1. We're computer scientists here, so we'll use big O notation. Number of computers in the world, on the order of 1. Number of programmers in the world, on the order of 1. 1945, 74 years ago, there was 1 programmer in the world, 1 computer in the world, big O. How many programmers are there now? In the world, how many programmers are there in the world? It's millions. Is it tens of millions? Could it be as big as 100 million? Could there be 100 million programmers in the world? Depends on if you count the VBA programmers, I suppose. Yay!
I think the better question is, how many does it take to change a light bulb?
6 weeks, because nothing takes less than 6 weeks. So, do the math with me here, because it's fascinating math. 74 years ago, there was one programmer in the world. Today, let's say it's 100 million, just for grants. Is this linear growth? Can't be linear growth. Must be exponential. Okay, well, if it's exponential, we can choose the base of the exponent. Let's choose the base of 2, because we're all programmers, so we will just count the powers of 2. Now, how many powers of 2 are there in 100 million? Come on, you know, base 2. Come on, simple. How many? What's a million? 2 to the what? 20. Good. Okay. What's 100? 2 to the what? No. Down a little from that. 728. 2 to the 27. 100 million is roughly 2 to the 27. Which means that there have been 27 doublings since Alan Turing to today. 74 years, 27 doublings. How many doublings is that per year? Or how many years per doubling? That might be the best way to do it. 74 divided by 27? Yeah, a little less than 3. Number of programmers in the world double every 3 years? Well, it's probably not fair, because in that first decade, the doubling rate was much higher. Alan Turing may have been the first programmer in 1945, but the day after that, there were 10. And the month after that, there were 100. So the doubling rate was probably very high during that first decade. And then after that, it kind of slowed down to maybe a doubling every 5 years. That's about where we are now. A doubling of the number of programmers every 5 years, which has a very interesting result. Half the programmers in the world have less than 5 years experience. And this will always be true as long as we're doubling at a rate of every 5 years. Half the programmers in the world will have less than 5 experience. People say, you know, well, programming is a young person's game. There's hardly any old people. Whatever happened to all the old people? We're all still here. There just weren't that many of us to begin with. When I started programming, maybe there were 10,000 programmers in the world. Maybe. Doubling every 5 years means that half the programmers in the world have less than 5 years experience. This leaves our industry in a state of perpetual inexperience. And that's where we have been for the last 74 years. By the 1950s, all that CRT memory was replaced by this stuff. Who's seen one of these? This is core memory. Anybody seen that file named core? Right? Something crashes in a Unix system and it leaves behind a file named core. This is why it's called a core. A core, that is, those are cores. These are little pieces of ferrite. Ferrite is powdered iron mixed with clay and then baked in an oven. These things are perhaps a millimeter in diameter. This actually is a personal core plant. I have this at home. I actually keep that thing around. It was from an old radar installation in the 50s. And this is 16,384 cores. 1 bit per. You can magnetize these things because they're made out of iron, so you can magnetize them north-south or south-north. And there's a clever little way that you can read them and write them. I won't go into the electronics involved. But I want you to look at that. How would you make that? Look closely. See all these wires woven in there? How would you make that? And I'll tell you how they made it. They made it by hand. They had looms, but they had people threading those wires. Every bit in a computer memory was touched by a human hand. Memory in those days was frightfully expensive, $1 a bit. Easily $1 a bit, if not more. The very first time I saw a megabyte was in the year, probably 1970. And it was in a big blue box. We had never seen a megabyte before. Megabytes, an enormous amount of memory. We had computers that we were using at the place I worked. One of them had 16K, the other had 64K. Those were big machines. And then they got a megabyte. And we all just kind of stared at it. There's 8 million bits in there. All core. Now, you didn't buy a megabyte. Not in those days. You rented it. You leased it from IBM at a rate of several thousands of dollars per month. The cost of that megabyte was probably $10 million in 1970 dollars. And yet, we made memory like crazy. We built these machines like nuts. We also got the vacuum tubes to work well. Started mass producing them. Anybody remember vacuum tubes? Yeah, a few of you, right? Old-fashioned transistors, sort of. We started mass producing these, and we got them to be pretty reliable. Started making actual computers that were a little bit better than that ACE machine that I told you about. By 1953, now this is only, what, 7 years, 8 years after Alan Turing wrote the very first bit of code? By 1953, Fortran had been invented. Who's written some Fortran? Look at that, all the old guys. Good. Fortran. Now, here's a bit of Fortran code. This is an if statement in Fortran. We actually used the word if in those days. If, and inside the parentheses here, there can be an expression. Why does that begin with an I? Old Fortran programmers, why does it begin with an integer? It's an integer. Any variable beginning with the letters I through N, which are the first two letters of integer, is an integer. Anything else is a floating point number. This is an expression, an integer expression, and then the compiler will evaluate that, and then it will jump to line 777 if the expression is negative. It'll jump to line 777 if the expression is 0. It will jump to line 704 if the expression is positive. That's an if statement in Fortran. That's how they worked. What are these line numbers? Well, you can see the line numbers here. And you might get confused because, look, here's line 799, and then there's line 601. The line numbers were not ordinal. You did not have to put them in order. You did not have to put a line number on a line. And if the line did not have a line number, it didn't have a line number. Right? The numbers were not significant of anything except as identifiers. Now, why didn't they use names? Why wouldn't you use a name? Why did they use numbers? If the numbers did not signify the order of the lines, why did they use numbers instead of names? A number can be contained in 2 bytes, but a name takes 1 byte per character. And memory was so damned expensive in those days that the design of the language admitted that we could not afford to invest in names for lines. Oh, anybody seen a punch card?
Yes.
Yeah, good, okay. And you see the code on the top, printed there in dot matrix form. Little holes, those holes were the encoding of the characters. This is where we would write our code. Anybody write code on punch cards? Look at that, got people who've written code. No, you didn't write the code on punch cards. You wrote the code here. Programmers in the 1960s and the 1950s did not know how to use a keyboard. Programmers did not know how to type. That was not a skill necessary to be a programmer in the 60s and 50s and even into the 70s. You wrote your code, literally, with a pencil on a coding form like that. Now, how'd you do that? Well, you sat at your desk and you got a whole bunch of these coding forms out and you started writing the code in pencil. And the editing tool used was an eraser. We would then execute the code in our minds. I know this is a foreign concept to most of you. A little butterfly. I put my tail between my legs, I ran out of that room and I went down into the basement and I taught myself to type on an 026 key punch. That's how I became a typing programmer. Most of the programmers at the time couldn't do that. After that, I never submitted another coding form again. I punched all my own cards. You'd get your deck of cards ready, put a rubber band around it. We knew rubber bands. There were rubber bands everywhere, and we got very good at handling rubber bands. We could shoot rubber bands distances that you can't imagine. We'd put a rubber band around that deck, we'd walk it down the hall to another room. This was the computer room. In these days, programmers were not allowed to touch the computer. You had no access to the actual machine. You were not allowed into the computer room. If you wanted to have a deck run through the compiler, if you wanted to execute a program, you walked up to the computer room door. This was a door with an electronic lock on it. And you made the necessary gestures of obeisance. And then you put your deck into the basket outside the door and you backed up. And the door would open. And this hairy arm would reach out and take the deck into the bowels of the computer room where it would sit until 3 in the morning. Why 3 in the morning? Because the machine was so expensive, it had to be running every minute of every day. It was constantly running jobs. And there was no time to run a compile. That was for much later. So at 3 in the morning, when all the batch jobs were finally done, the operators would get all the programmers' decks, stack them up in the card reader, push the button, and then they'd go get some coffee. And then they'd tear off all the listings at the end and they'd put them out on a table the next day. You'd walk up to that table, you'd see your name on a listing, you'd take it back to your desk. You'd open up that listing and realize that you forgot a comma. This is the way we wrote code in those days. The time from submitting a compile until you got the result was 24 to 48 hours. Right? There was none of this nonsense of, oh, just compile it. Let's try it again. Oh, no, it works. None of that stuff. You stared at those listings for a very long time. How did you get any work done? Well, you worked on 10 or 15 programs at the same time. So you had this constant conveyor belt of programs going into the computer and coming out the next day. By 1958, Lisp had been invented. Who's written any Lisp? Look at that. We'll all be programming in Lisp soon. That's the final language. All languages will die, and Lisp will be the only survivor. The proof of this, of course, is that Lisp is the language that has refused to die. We've tried to kill it. It won't go away. It keeps coming back. So eventually it will win, and we'll all be Lisp programmers. But that was 1958, Lisp. Functional programming, that was the first functional programming language. 1954 to 1960, IBM sold 140 7.0 whatever computers. These were very fancy machines. They were vacuum tube machines. A little bit slow. Notice who's programming it. They're very expensive. They were purchased by weather stations and military installations and maybe the largest companies. There weren't very many of them. The people programming them were these women. We got Grace Hopper up there to the left. Grace Hopper is the woman who invented the word compiler, wrote the very first compiler ever. It was a compiler called A0. And eventually was influential enough to give us the COBOL language, which is unfortunate. Anybody did any COBOL? Oh, God, I'm sorry. And you're still functioning. COBOL's a tough... The idea behind COBOL was morally high. I mean, it was great. It was a great ethical statement. Let's have a language that reads like English. It was horrible. Horrible. But they didn't know. They didn't know back then that it would be horrible. They thought, yes, programmers actually want to spell out the word multiply. She was responsible for some of that. She actually became the CTO of Sperry Rand. Of course, they weren't called CTOs in those days. She was a VP of Sperry Rand. But she climbed through the ranks pretty high. This was an extremely significant person in our industry. The women I show here are the programmers of the ENIAC, the very first computer in the United States, which was not a coded machine the way we would think of code. They actually programmed this by using punch panels. And the punch panels were really difficult to do. Here you see these women. These women were the people who made this machine work. They didn't build the machine. They programmed it by punching those chords in. By 1960, the number of computers in the world on the order of 100. The number of programmers in the world on the order of 1,000. We needed far more programmers than there were machines, because the machines had to be kept busy all the time. They were expensive. And there were no libraries, no frameworks, no subroutine libraries. There was nothing. If the code executed, it was because you wrote it. Nothing executed unless you wrote it. Programmers in those days understood their machines to the bit level. So we needed many more programmers than there were machines for a very long time. Who were these programmers? There were no college courses. You couldn't learn how to program in college. Computers were brand new. The college professors had never written any code. They didn't know what this was about. Who were these programmers? Well, they were drawn from inside the companies and inside the facilities. You'd get your most trusted people, people with a lot of experience in the business, people who had been around the block a few times. You'd say, guys, we need you to try this new thing. You need to learn how to program these computers. And these would be the programmers of the early era. From the 1950s to the 1960s, they had no manuals to read, no books had been published. All they had was some specifications, and they figured out how to program these machines. They were engineers and scientists and mathematicians drawn from the highest of levels, and they were all old. These people were in their 30s and 40s and 50s. The transistor came along very rapidly, shrank things down enormously. All the vacuum tubes got replaced by these little things, and these little things kept on getting smaller and smaller and smaller. You may not remember transistor radios. I remember them. Plastic things that came from Japan. By 1965, IBM had produced 10,000 1401s. These were transistor-based machines. And they would rent them for a ridiculously small price, $2,500 a month. That was stupidly cheap. A business of moderate size could afford that. And so people started buying these machines. And they would put them on the floor. Of course, they didn't come with any software. There were no, maybe there was a compiler, maybe there was a COBOL compiler or a Fortran compiler. There was no real operating system. They all ran on punch cards still, maybe a little bit of magnetic tape. Magnetic tape was just a faster punch card reader. All that stuff on the magnetic tape was just card images, at first. There were no discs. Well, here's a disc. That disc had a platter. The disc platters were 36 inches in diameter. The disc itself weighed a ton. It floated on mercury bearings. Right? It would rotate up to speed. I want you to think about a ton of metal rotating at like 1,800 RPM. Right? A lot of kinetic energy in that. I was in a room once with one of those. You turn it on. It sounds like a jet engine going. And the whole room shakes. And then it gets up to its resonant velocity and it quiets out. And the whole room settles down. And you're looking at this thing thinking, that thing's a monster. We walked up to it one day. There were little metal filings falling out from inside. You open up the door. There's a little pile of metal filings in there. We called the maintenance guy over. The maintenance guy looks at that, and all the blood runs out of his face, and he pushes the power button. He says, when those things cut loose, they'll go through a concrete block wall. Number of computers in the world have now grown to the tens of thousands. The number of programmers in the world was still about 10 times higher than that. Now we're talking about 1965. This is only 20 years after Turing. And in 20 years after Turing, there's tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of programmers. There's tens of thousands of computers in the world, and it's just a spit in the bucket. I stop here and reflect, because at this point I'm 13 years old. And I'd already written a little bit of code for that plastic computer of mine. By 1965, where were the programmers coming from, these tens of thousands of programmers? There weren't enough engineers and mathematicians and scientists to go around. And there were also no computer science grads. The first computer science course at university would wait until the 1970s. So you couldn't get a whole bunch of kids coming out of school. You still had to hire from inside the company, but all the mathematicians and scientists and really good people were gone, so then you had to go down a level. And I'm not sure down is the right word, but you drew from the best and brightest of non-technical people, accountants and planners and marketing people. You tried to get anybody you could, and some of them would come. And these people were still old. Well, they may be a little younger than before, but they were still generally old, 30s and 40s. So programmers during this period were old and experienced people. They weren't young. Though not mathematicians, they were experienced, disciplined, professional people. Turing would likely have approved. Maybe. Mathematicians of discipline. By 1966, IBM was producing 1,000 IBM 360s every month. The machines really started to crank now. The assembly lines are pouring off these machines. I worked on a machine like this for some time. They were beautiful machines. Lights blinking like mad. You know, the old science fiction movies got this pretty right? Except that they didn't do it in checkerboard patterns the way they all did. But I mean, they would flash. If you were a good programmer, you could stare at the pattern of the lights blinking and recognize what phase your system was operating in, and you could debug it. You could look at it and say, that pattern's not right. We were pretty good at that kind of stuff. Oh, these are the discs, right? The discs had shrunk down to 14-inch platters by now. So we could actually get real discs, and they were removable packs. By 1966, Ole Johan Dahl, Christian Nygaard had invented object orientation. Who's using an object-oriented language right now? Oh, look at that, all of you. Well, almost all of you, right? Well, these guys invented it in 1966. Right? The very first object-oriented language was Simula 67. They invented it in 66. They published it in 67. It was a language based on Algol, which was a language that had been based on Fortran, sort of. And then a fellow by the name of Jarnus Trustrup, who was a Simula programmer, was told he had to write C. He didn't want to write C. So he wrote a little preprocessor in front of C to make it look like Simula. He eventually called that language C++. C++, of course, evolved into Java. Java was just a small version of C++. Anybody writing Java now? Or how about C#? Who's doing C#? Which is Java. And then what are the rest of you doing? JavaScript, which has nothing to do with Java. The guy who wrote JavaScript, anybody know his name? The author of JavaScript, anybody know his name? Brendan Eich, very good. Brendan Eich. Brendan Eich was one of the early engineers at Mozilla. He was one of the guys who gave us early web browsers and web servers, and then eventually Mozilla promoted him to be the CEO. And then it was discovered that he had voted the wrong way on Proposition 8 in California, and there was a huge social outcry that he couldn't possibly be the CEO of this company, and he had to resign. And that was the moment that you and I became political. That your political beliefs and your political motivations would decide your fate in this industry. And I want you to think about that one very carefully. This guy's named Edsger Dijkstra, 1968. Edsger Dijkstra is a guy, he was born in the Netherlands. He suffered through the Nazi occupation during World War II, came out of that as a young man, went to university, decided to study nuclear physics, as any good young man at that age would. And then he saw his very first computer, and he fell in love. And he thought, I want to be a computer scientist. But, and he went to his thesis advisor, said, there's no discipline, there's no body of knowledge. If I become a computer scientist, no one will consider me. I cannot tell you how controversial that was in 1968. I was a young programmer at the time, and I remember this raging. Go-to? Harmful? How could you possibly write code without go-to? You've got to go places. You've got to jump places. How can you possibly write code without go-to? But Dijkstra had outlined an entire system for avoiding go-to. I won't go through the whole technical argument here, although you will find it fascinating if you study it. And note that you probably don't have a go-to in any of your languages. Because in the end, Dijkstra won his battle over that. All of the go-tos that are significant, at least, got removed from the languages. 1968, Ken Thompson, Dennis Ritchie. Dennis Ritchie has passed away now. He's gone. Ken Thompson's still around. The pioneers in this field have begun to fall away. 1968, Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie go down into the basement of AT&T and they invent two things, C and Unix. They were not told to do this. Their bosses did not come to them one day and say, you will now invent C and Unix. They just went down into the basement like any good set of hackers, and a couple of weeks later they came out with the language that changed the world and the operating system that changed the world, that we all still depend upon today. Greatly advanced, of course. Who had done all this stuff? All those more experienced people that had been hired long before there were computer science courses, long before there was colleges that would teach you how to do computer science. These were the people who had taught themselves and had learned how to do computers and how to do software and had laid the foundations for the rest of us. By 1970, Digital Equipment Corporation was producing 50,000 PDP-8s. Who's seen a PDP-8? One guy. One guy seen a PDP-8. I have one in my office.
Museum.
Doesn't work. What's that?
In a museum.
It's in a museum. Yeah. That's where they all are. They're all in museums. You can still see them. Go to the Ancient Computer Conference. Right? You'll find them in there. There's still a few of them running in the world, but they were really popular in the 70s. Thousands, tens of thousands of these machines. And they were cheap too. This is a PDP-8S right here. You could buy that. 4K of core, 48 microsecond add time. You could buy that. It would run Fortran. You could buy that for $10,000. I had a good buddy, Tim Conrad. He and I would sit in our high school study halls and plot how we were going to get $10,000 to buy a PDP-8S. Never quite managed it. We thought about it a lot. Number of computers in the world, tens of thousands now, probably hundreds of thousands. How many programmers in the world? Millions. Still a 10-to-1 ratio because there weren't any frameworks, weren't really any operating systems. We didn't have the leverage yet of all that old code that we all now depend upon. There's 1 million programmers in the world now. Where'd they come from? Who were they? Hundreds of thousands of computers, 1 million programmers. It's only 1970. It's only 25 years after Turing. That was when I got my first job as a programmer. That's me at the age of 18. I got my first job as a programmer, but I was not alone. Tens of thousands of new computer science graduates were leaving the colleges because it was pretty well known in the 1970s that if you wanted to get paid well, be a programmer. It was obvious, right? All the technical people wanted to be programmers. CS graduates were coming off the mill, EE and CS graduates were coming off the mill in huge numbers. And they all had something in common. We, because I count myself in this cohort, we're all stupidly young, and we were almost all male. For some reason, the people graduating from those courses were primarily male. Not sure why. The first job I ever had, there were 24 programmers on the order, 24 programmers, mostly in their 30s and 40s. This would have been in the very early 70s. Half of them were women. I walked into a room full of programmers, and half of the people in that room were women. Maybe not quite half. But a lot of women. 10 years later, I was working at an engineering company, and we had maybe 50 or so programmers, but there were hardly any women. Maybe 3. Something happened in that decade, and the women fled, and they had to have fled. It's not that they just went away because of attrition. They must have run, because there were so many, and then there were so few. Computer science today remains a field dominated by men more than any other. more than any other, by a huge margin. You can look at the curves. The curves are startling. This is the curves of women in STEM fields. The green lines are all the other STEM fields. These are just women entering college for STEM stuff. And look at what happens here. Sometime around the early 80s, it just nosedives. And I think this is wrong because, at least in my experience, it started out here, sometime in the mid-70s. Don't know why. Some of the women in the room might be able to tell us, but I don't know. Businesses, however, had to have programmers. They had these machines. They spent a lot of money on these machines. They had to have people to program them. And coming out of the schools, a whole bunch of young men. And what young men lack in discipline, they make up for in energy. You can convince a young man to work 80 hours a week. I know, I worked 80 hours a week. Who's done that? Anybody here done that? Work 8? Yeah, look at all the old guys. And we wore it as a badge, too. You know, we'd get a little piece of paper with an 80 on it and stick it to it. We were idiots. We were also dirt cheap. Didn't cost a lot to hire young programmers in those days. On my first job, I earned $7,200 a year. God, that was so much money. For an 18-year-old, that was a car payment, enough to pay my parents a little bit for rent. $7,200. I could hardly wait for the time when I would earn $10,000 a year. It took me several years to get there, too. Now, I want you to remember, up to this point, the programmers had all been disciplined professionals. They didn't need a lot of management or process because they'd all been old. They'd been around the block a few times. They understood what the business was about. They understood schedules. They understood deadlines. They understood what to leave in and what to leave out. Seeger, that old Seeger song, Against the Wind. And these people had worked the miracles that had brought the industry to that time. Yeah? These are the people who wrote the IBM 360 virtual memory operating system. These are the people who went to the moon, or who sent us, wrote the code that took us to the moon. These are the people who invented structured and functional and object-oriented programming and Fortran and COBOL and ALGOL and Lisp and C and Unix. All that stuff had been produced by those original cohorts before the flood of young men came into the industry. Those original programmers knew how to get big things done. What process did they use? Agile. Who's heard of Agile?
Everybody.
Well, of course everybody has. Who's doing Agile? Yeah, whatever. Agile Light, Agile Scrum-gile, whatever. Okay. All right. There's an old saying, Agile is the process that is observed to be used by programmers in the wild. If you go back into the time of the early space program, and you talk to those people, what process did they use? They will talk about how they wrote their code in short iterations, and how they wrote their unit tests in the morning and made them pass in the afternoon. They were using a process that we would call Agile today. Of course, they didn't call it Agile. And why would they be using a process like that? Well, because that's the process that humans have always used for the last 50,000 years to get anything done. Work in small steps and test everything along the way. But hordes of young testosterone-driven men, they need discipline imposed upon them from above. And managers sought for that discipline, and they found it in a paper written by Winston Royce in the 70s. And they invented the waterfall process. How many of you have done some waterfall? Ooh, all the old guys. Right? We're going to do all the requirements, and then the analysis phase. We'll finish the analysis, and then we'll do the design. And we'll finish the design, and then we'll code it, and then it'll work. Now, as insane as that sounds, we tried for 30 years to make that work. Because when you're 22 years old and you've got a boss telling you, yeah, this is the way you're going to do it, that's the way you're going to do it. We honestly thought this was a godsend. I was a young man at the time when this started coming out, and I thought, oh my God, thank you. Thank you for some kind of process that I can use to measure my progress through a software project. It was 30 years later we finally gave it up. Because waterfall dominated us from 1970 to 2000. Where's my timer?
We're,
Is that you, right?
we're.
Have you been waving at me this whole time?
Yeah, I've tried a couple
He's
times.
sitting there, you know,
Try
Bob,
to
you only
get
got
by.
5 minutes. You know what? So guess what? I'm done. We're done?
We're at 2:30. I haven't seen anyone try to come in yet. If you have a few last things you want to finish
A
up.
few last things to say. This talk is mostly an entertainment talk. I do this for fun. I think it's important for people coming into the industry to know where this industry started, who started it, and how it began. And most people getting into the industry today do not know this stuff. So I do this for fun, and it's fun for me. I hope it was fun for you. I will entertain a question or two if anybody has one before they burst into that door. Yes, sir.
Anything change in your opinion now in the age of data and that's the building of applications is not necessarily a fundamental function, but it's being driven by other areas of data science and machine learning?
Has anything changed based on the application of data science and machine learning? Is that something new? No. It's not even a little bit new. We were doing data programming 30 years ago. And what about machine learning? Is that the new thing? Are we all going to be facing down intelligent computers? No. Are there going to be self-driving cars on the road? No. Not soon. Probably not ever. Well, I can't say not ever. Probably not anytime soon. Oh, in very restricted environments, you might get machine learning to take a truck on the highway, for example, or maybe learn how to go in a very narrow area of a particular city. But when it's snowing outside and the wind is blowing and it's crazy, you don't want those machines out there. You do not want the life of your children depending on an if statement written at 3 in the morning by a 22-year-old. And with that, I will close my talk. Thank you all.